A Woman's Response to The Rational Male by Rollo Tomassi. Okay, very quickly before we get started, I just wanted to give you guys a couple quick notes. Number one, I know there have been a lot of sound issues, and so I've got this thing in. Hopefully, this helps with the sound issues. If it doesn't, my husband and I have been talking about saving up some money for a microphone, but that's at a point in the distant future. Hopefully, this works so we don't have to do that. I know it looks probably really ridiculous, but that's the best I've come up with so far. Hopefully, on this particular video, it helps so that you guys can actually hear me. Also, I wanted to talk about why I'm making this video, or actually this series of videos, since it's going to be multiple chapters from the book. Ever since I got a BitChute account, and even before I got a BitChute account, but especially since I got a BitChute account, I've had a lot of young men coming to my page and ranting about how evil women are, because of course I was an exotic dancer, so clearly I've been, victimizing men. And also I had an abortion, which, let's just ignore the fact that it happened for purely medical reasons. That's another one of those terrible, awful, evil things that women do. So clearly I'm just the epitome of all that is horrific about women. And so I've got a lot of MGTOW guys who are just commenting on my pages like, you're a filthy whore. Which is funny because I actually really like, I really like men's rights advocacy. I really like men. Like, I spent 8 years as an exotic dancer. Pretty much all I did during that time was sit around and talk with dudes. And so I actually have a lot of sympathy for these guys who are coming over to my page and screaming and ranting about how women are hypergamous evil bitches. Which is why I made the hypergamy video last week. It's like, look, guys, hypergamy has a place in human sexuality. It's not this horrible thing. It's part of who we are. It's part of what makes us human. There's a very good reason that it evolved. And I had a few comments from people who were like, well, yeah, of course it evolved for a reason. And they pretty much laid out, even in better words than I had, exactly why it evolved. Women have to choose the best possible mate. That's what humans do. Men choose the best possible mate. They tend to have more of a scattershot method. But I mean, the whole mating game is about finding the best possible person to pair up with. And so the fact that women might be inclined to do this isn't necessarily some indication that they're evil and devious. It's just human nature. And so when I said that, I got a little bit of, I had one person, and they weren't like an angry MGTOW guy either, but who commented and said, look, you should read Rollo Tomassi's book. And I had been, up until that point, been thinking about making this video for this week about, maybe some of these guys who are really, really MGTOW and really, really angry, maybe they should consider some of this pickup artist stuff. Because, I mean, I had a lot of friends who were pickup artists, and I spent a lot of time around pickup artists. Maybe this will help you, And then somebody suggested I read Rollo Tomassi's book, and it was like, I've read a bunch of Rollo Tomassi's work. I've read his blog, which is what he based the book off of. I kind of know where he's coming from. I don't necessarily agree with everything he says, but it would probably be wise for some of these guys who've been visiting my page and screaming about how I'm a evil, awful, baby killing whore or whatever. Maybe it would help some of them to hear about some of these ideas a little bit. That book is probably a really good starting point for, guys who might need that kind of advice. And it was really funny because I started reading the book, and I think on the day that I started reading the book, and I was trying to crank my way through that thing as fast as I could. So I was like, I don't know. Let's see. I think it was close to a quarter of the way through the book, and my husband called me up, and he didn't call me, he texted me, and he was telling me about one of his coworkers who was having trouble with his girlfriend. I was like right away, I was like, here, take this book. This will help you. So we told his coworker that this book would help him with his girlfriend problems, and I guess he says his coworker was happy to get it. So that was kind of ironic and funny that happened right when I started reading the book. Hopefully, it does actually help him with his girlfriend problems. But I mean, honestly, it is a book that I would very happily recommend to men who are trying to figure out how women work. Either because they're beginning dating, or because they've been dating for a while without terrible success, or because they're just frustrated with dating and they feel like they're stuck in a rut. This is just a good this is a good book to read. This is a good introduction to how human sexuality works on a biological and psychological level. I'm not going to say he gets everything right. There are things he says that I disagree with, but he's right on enough things. It's a pretty good book to read. I don't think I've ever encountered anything where I'd be like, yep, this is totally your only resource that you're ever going to need. This is it. But, it's a good enough starting resource to go from. And so it would probably be good for me to make some videos about that so that, maybe while these guys are running through my page yelling about how I'm a whore, or there was one guy who took links to my page and posted them up next to links to porn sites and called me I can't remember, a dog fucking whore or something like that. I can't remember. That guy right there, he probably would benefit from, maybe reading this book a little bit. That being said, I'm going to start on chapter 1 and I'll kind of go through the whole chapter or section. I think that there are chapters within the sections, but I'm just going to start on the first big section. And I'll talk about that during this video in portions. And then next week's video, I'll probably talk about the next one. I don't really know how I want to do this. And so some feedback from you guys would be excellent. I'm probably just going to do my reactions as a woman who's reading it and my thoughts on this. Now, I'm probably not your average woman. I'm kind of familiar with a lot of these ideas already, so I'm not going to be like, oh my God, I'm so offended that he mentioned this. There are a few things I disagree with, like I said, but I'll do that. And I'll try to give a very brief summary for people who haven't read the book, but I'm probably going to be talking about, it's a meaty enough book that I would honestly just recommend you go and read the book yourself and then watch my videos, or, watch my videos. And if you're inspired to read the book, then read the book, But I'm definitely not going to give probably a clear enough or a detailed enough overview of the book that you're going to know what the book is about just from watching these videos. Which is probably for the best. It's a good book. You should go and read it. I just have some things and some issues that I think would be interesting to talk about and interesting to discuss in regards to the book, and also just to kind of familiarize certain gentlemen who might possibly be watching my videos about, how things work. Anyway, here we go. Okay, so in this first section, Tomassi spends a lot of time talking about one-itis. And one-itis is this idea that there is a soul mate for everyone in the world. And it's a very common idea, and he's basically ripping it apart, which is probably for the best. The problem that I see with one-itis as it's discussed out in the world is that a lot of people will take monogamous thinking or monogamy as a form of one-itis. And I don't agree with that. And I don't think that Tomassi in his book agrees with that either. In fact, he's married. So monogamy in and of itself is not bad, and it's not unhealthy, and it definitely serves its purposes. And we'll probably get more into that later. The problem with one-itis is that it's something separate from monogamy. It's an unhealthy offshoot of the idea of monogamy. This fixation that people who are not necessarily very experienced in dating can have when they find someone. Since this book is written for men, it's basically men who find a woman who fits their idea of what the ideal of a woman is, and they just fixate on her, and they're like, that's the one. And they don't have a healthy relationship with her. They don't build a healthy relationship with her. She might or might not actually be particularly interested in them, but they have this idea that this woman, for whatever reasons, is the one. And if they fail to get a relationship with her, they can become very depressed and very upset, or they can spend, years sometimes doggedly following after her, just hoping that they can get a chance at a relationship with her because they're certain that she's the one. And while they're doing this, they're missing lots and lots of life opportunities, lots of personal growth and develop opportunities, and opportunities to develop relationships with women who might even be better than this one. And so the idea is that there is no one. It's a really, he explains it in much more depth and greater detail, But the quick takeaway, the Cliff Notes takeaway is that there is no one. And this is a very true thing. Like, I will say this about the book. Most of it, like, there's a reason we gave it to my husband's coworker. It's a good dating manual for men. It's especially good as a beginning dating manual for men. Like, if you're still trying to figure out women, and if you're just starting to figure out women, this is a really good place to start. And it's a good introduction to the pickup artist community as well. He spends a good portion of time throughout the book, and I'm jumping ahead here, talking about how men react when they encounter these ideas that float around the pickup artist community, and their immediate response is, oh my god, no, that can't be right, that goes against everything I've ever heard before, that goes against everything that I know, that goes against everything that I believe about human sexuality. And one-itis and the debunking of the soulmate myth is really the beginning of the book, but it's also the beginning of Tomassi's process of sort of tearing down these ideas that you have in your head that create the framework of your interaction with women or men. Again, the book is primarily geared toward men. I just happen to be a woman who's reading it. I don't disagree with him here at all. Like, he's spot on. He really is. My only caution would be that a lot of people think monogamy itself is unhealthy. And I very strongly disagree with that. I grew up in a monogamous home. And frequently the template that we see as we're growing up from our parents is the template we later follow in our own lives when it comes to relationships, especially intimate relationships. So if you grew up and your mom was a single mom, you're more likely to become a single mother or have trouble maintaining that marriage. Now, that doesn't mean that it's impossible. There are many men who look at it and say, I had a single mother, it was not a good thing, I'm going to do better. But, I mean, my template was a very monogamous household. My parents were both virgins when they got married, and they stayed married, and they were extremely loyal to one another. And so that was my world. That was what I aimed for. And as a woman, aiming for monogamy is kind of, different than a man aiming for monogamy. More on that later. But that's what I was working towards. That's what I expected. And so I would encounter people who would be like, oh, you're just in love with the idea of being in love. And, oh, monogamy isn't really marriage. Marriage isn't as successful as people think it is. Why are you looking for that? And it's like, no, it works. People do have successful monogamous lifelong relationships. And so in reading the book, and also just in reading this chapter, I would caution people to remember that one-itis is an unhealthy attachment to the idea of the one, who is not necessarily a person, but an idealized version of a person that you're kind of placing over some individual who might or might not actually be interested in you. It's not monogamy or the commitment that comes with monogamy. More on that later. Moving on. Along with one-itis, one of the other things Tomassi talks about in this section of the book is the idea of power and power within relationships. And he does a very good job of it, which I'm going to be praising this book a lot. Just get used to that idea. I do disagree with things he said, but this isn't one of them. The quote that I just read here is very, very true. And it's kind of what I was pointing out with the whole hypergamy video I made earlier. Manifestations of power are not necessarily power themselves. And one of the things that I've always found very annoying when people are trying to talk about hypergamy is their tendency to measure manifestations of power and assume that that is hypergamy. And that's not necessarily what women are going to be interested in. Manifestations of power are nice and all, but true power is, as he says in the book, control over one's own circumstances in life. It's not necessarily the money, the property, the stuff. Everybody always likes to talk about this stuff, and it's very annoying to me. I was an extremely hypergamous person. I still am an extremely hypergamous person. Anyway, in my dating life, I was always extremely hypergamous, and money didn't mean anything to me. You have enough to pay your bills, great. Then money's useless after that. Like, who cares? Is there a roof over your head? Okay, good. Is there food in your belly? Okay, good. Does money really mean that much after that? And while being very hypergamous, also a very ascetic kind of person. So I really don't spend money on a lot of stuff, which can be really handy, actually. But I do have a tendency toward asceticism, and so I didn't like the concept of hypergamy always being based around stuff. And I understand why people talk about hypergamy in terms of stuff. It's like you can measure stuff. But I really appreciate that he took the time to talk about power as it plays in a relationship, and power as it is as it actually is, and not how it is simply manifested. And power does play in a relationship. One of the things that I'm going to say, which is going a bit off topic, I'm going to wander off topic here a lot probably, but women are not necessarily the leaders in relationships, and this is something that a lot of feminists are very uncomfortable with, and a lot of women these days who've been kind of raised in this feminist atmosphere or pro-feminist atmosphere, they have this idea that they're strong, powerful, independent individuals. And I say this as a woman who was strong and powerful and independent and very much an individual. You still want a man who's going to take a leadership position in your relationship. You still want the man to have that role as the leader and to maintain a certain degree of power in the relationship. And this is difficult for women to swallow sometimes. And women will always be like, well, there's an exception to every rule. And there's an exception to every rule. Somewhere out there, there is a woman who wants to lead men instead of be led by men. Somewhere. Odds are, if you're a woman and you're watching this video, it's still not you. It certainly wasn't me. And I was, as I said, very strong, physically, mentally, very strong, very independent. Still wanted a man to take a leadership role. In fact, one of the reasons I think I was struggling to find a partner for such a long time, and one of the reasons I was alone for such a long time, was because I was still looking for a strong and, for lack of a better word, powerful man to take a leadership position in a relationship with me. And I did eventually find that. And I kind of held out until I could find it, because up until that point, I simply wasn't impressed with the men I met. And so, it's good advice. If you're a guy who's watching this and thinking, oh God, power in a relationship, power over women, this is horrible. As a woman, I am telling you, this is actually very sound advice in a relationship. You don't want the woman taking the reins and leading the relationship off wherever she wants it to go. You don't want her being the one telling you where to go, what to do. It is much better. Most of the time, like 99.99% of the time, it is much better for the man to be in charge. And women get upset about this. They think, well, I don't want to be some stupid little woman who lives in the kitchen. And it's like, that's not what a good, healthy relationship is. Men are the leaders, but they need a second command. They need somebody that they can rely on, somebody they can trust, somebody who is worthy of them and worthy of their companionship. And I personally talk about worthiness in relationships a lot. I spent a long time struggling to find a worthy man, a man who is worthy of my attention and worthy of my love and worthy of having sex with me. And when I met him, my goal was to make myself the kind of woman who would always be worthy of his companionship and his respect. Because even though I saw him as a leader, I saw myself as his second in command when it came to our family unit. And it's very important for a leader to have someone that they can rely on working underneath them. No pun intended. No pun intended on that one. But no, that's a very important thing. And I think women, when they have the idea, or when the idea is brought to them that they should find a man who is slightly above them, slightly more powerful. This is a very hypergamous idea, by the way. For those of you who are complaining about hypergamy, like hypergamy is terrible, women want a man who's slightly more powerful. They want a man who is somewhat higher in status and rank than them. And by status and rank, I'm not talking about, again, manifestations of power. I'm talking about true power. His strength and ability to navigate the world, his strength to control himself and the situations that he finds himself in. That's power. Women are going to want a man who is more powerful than they are. But for women who are listening to that, that doesn't necessarily mean you should become powerless or that you should be without power of your own. I've frequently looked at it and thought that any status or power of my own that I brought into the relationship benefited my husband because suddenly he had a high status partner. If I was a beautiful woman, he was the kind of man who could attract a beautiful woman. If I was a desirable woman, then that made him the kind of man who could attract desirable women. My power built up his power, and vice versa. That's honestly how a relationship should work. You should be building each other's strength and building each other's power. But most often, almost always, the man is going to be the more powerful person in a relationship, and if he is not, he's going to lose the woman's respect. So understanding power and knowing how power works in a relationship is a very useful thing. This is Tomassi's cardinal rule of relationships, and it's a very good rule for men to know if they are hoping to have sex with women. I have met way too many men in my life who do not understand this rule, and I think the worst offender was a guy who used to constantly shower me with gifts, and it was very apparent that he wanted me to sleep with him, and I didn't want to sleep with him. But every time I met up with him or hung out with him, it would be like, here's some jewelry, here's some clothes, here's some underwear that I bought for you, here's some perfume. I didn't want these things. I didn't ask for these things. There were several times where I said, I can't accept this. You need to cut it out. You need to stop. I do not want these things. It's very nice of you and it's very sweet of you, but I am not going to have sex with you just because you buy me stuff. I knew another guy, of course, who thought that after he bought me dinner enough times that I just owed him sex. That's not how it works. And men have this idea. Like I literally thought this guy was hanging out with me just to hang out with me. Like I thought we were buddies and we were hanging out, we were having fun. We would chat, he'd laugh, he seemed to be enjoying himself. It was like, this is awesome. I've got a friend. I'm the kind of girl who has male friends. Like I don't always understand female thinking or feminine thought. Tomassi actually in his book talks about, covert communication. I'm not good at that sort of thing. I don't understand it, and I'm actually really, really bad at it. So I don't always get along very well with women. So frequently, especially when I was single, I would seek out the company of men because men are much more straightforward. They're much more easy to understand. When they say something, they mean what they say. When a woman says something, there's this like whole undercurrent of meaning that you have to pick through, and it's like, who has the time or energy for that shit? I certainly don't. So I was hanging out with this guy. I thought he was just a buddy, and the next thing I know, he's like, well, I've bought, approximately $500 worth of meals now, so you owe me sex. So I guess we're not just buddies after all, and no way in hell. No way in hell. But I mean, even on a smaller scale, men do this. They get into a relationship with a woman. This is something that a lot of people who've read Tomassi's book have talked about. They got into a relationship and the sex was just, it was there, it was constant, it was ready, it was hot and heavy, and all the wonderful, glorious things you want sex to be. It was very, very passionate. And then they got into a long-term relationship with the woman, and suddenly the sex started to dry up. It got a little bit less and less frequent, and then it just wasn't there, and she wasn't in the mood, and she had a headache. And what some guys do at that point is they try to negotiate their way back into bed with the woman, where they take out the garbage, they buy her flowers, they rub her feet, they watch the annoying romance movie that she's been wanting to see together. even though it drives them up a wall, they do all these little tiny things in the hope that eventually she'll be willing to, kind of soften up and have sex with them. It doesn't work. So, stop doing that. It's degrading and it's not going to get you what you want anyway. So, this was the first stumbling block that I really had with this book. This was the first thing where I stopped and looked and said, wait a minute, I don't do that, do I? And I understand that in this book, he's talking about elements of human sexuality and elements that generally exist in the human subconscious. He's talking about behavioral psychology. So, this is the sort of thing that you can observe looking at a person's actions that they might not necessarily be aware of themselves. And so, this was the first thing that I looked at and was like, really? No, no. And so, that's why I'm mentioning it in this chapter, because as a woman reading this book, this was what tripped me up in this chapter the most, or this section. I can't tell if it's a section or a chapter. I think it's actually a section instead of a chapter. The idea of competition anxiety, and the idea that competition anxiety drives women's sexual output to a partner. I almost don't know where to begin. I mean, I've always been extremely voracious when it comes to sex with my husband. That's who I am. That's how I am when I'm with him. The idea that that is driven by competition anxiety really just doesn't sound right to me. And so I was sitting around thinking about it quite a lot. And it's like, I read further in the book. I haven't gotten all the way through the book yet because the school week started and I don't have enough much time in my life. But reading ahead in the book, I've seen other mentions of competition anxiety. And I'm very curious about competition anxiety because it didn't click right for me. And I do realize that it's a subconscious thing. So there are probably bits of me that have a certain degree of competition anxiety that I'm not even aware are functioning within my psychology. However, it still really doesn't sound like me. And so I was trying to think about all the instances in my life where my behavior could have been driven by competition and anxiety, and it still felt like a bit of a stretch. I am not saying that you, as a reader, should look at competition anxiety and say, oh no, this isn't actually a real thing, or oh no, there are many women out there who don't have this as an issue. I think the majority of women show plenty of evidence of having competition anxiety in their lives. And he even describes some of the behaviors that are prompted by competition anxiety, not least among them being women's voracious sexual appetite when you begin a relationship and when they suspect that other women might steal you away. Which I am going to say there are other things that could be causing that, and I want to talk about that. But most women do have this competition anxiety. I've watched enough strippers and strip clubs. I've seen the way they act around each other. This is totally a thing that women do. I'm not convinced it's a thing that I do. And I've been trying to figure out why that might be. And I think part of it is my upbringing, which was extremely humbling. Anytime any little shred of like ego or, shred of confidence started, growing inside of me, somebody would come along and just smack that thing down so damn fast. Like, I grew up being beaten down a lot, to the point that when I finally got out of high school, I was just I was a mess. Like, I was this beaten down, broken, pathetic thing. I was highly disposable. Then I entered into the strip club world and I became a very desirable thing. And I had all of this, for lack of a better term, sexual power that I generated for myself and very, very rapidly. I started dancing and the next thing I knew, men were throwing money at me and asking me to go out and asking me for sex, and they all wanted me and they're throwing all this attention at me. And it was definitely a head spinning kind of experience, but I think I also had enough perspective from all the, I mean, it was not shy of just straight up humiliation that I had endured as a younger person, as a child growing up. I don't think it went to my head the same way it goes to other women's heads. And I think that I had enough perspective at that point in my life to step back and look at the world and see the way people around me were interacting. And I've noticed, like, over the years as I was dancing, I was always surrounded by extraordinarily beautiful women, women who looked better than me, women who were prettier, sexier, more graceful, more athletic, more muscular, anything. Women with longer hair, women with better makeup, women with prettier faces. I was always surrounded by that, and I very quickly realized that, at least in the strip club world, and the strip club world is honestly, it's a miniature version of the dating world. It's like a little playground where you can figure out the rules and then take them out into the real world and apply them. It's really handy in that sense. It doesn't matter if other people are better than you. It doesn't matter if other people are more alpha than you. It doesn't matter if other people around you are hotter than you are. It doesn't mean a damn thing. There was always a prettier girl in the club. There will always be a prettier girl in the club. There will always be a prettier girl out there. There will always be a hotter man in that bar that night than you. And it doesn't matter. The dating game is about going in and getting yours and getting out. It doesn't matter what's going on in the periphery. If you're a dancer and you're in a strip club and you're earning your money, it doesn't matter that the other girl is hotter. You're earning your money. You're making plenty of money. You don't need to be hotter than her to get what you came for. In the strip club, it's money. In the dating world, it's, well, for me as a woman, the guy I want. If I can get the attention of the guy I want and zero in on him and keep his attention and hold on to it, I don't really need to be competing with the most beautiful woman out there. I'm just keeping that man's attention. And so I don't feel particularly competitive and I don't feel particularly insecure. And it would make sense that I wouldn't feel insecure having been a stripper for as long as I was and having all of that sexual power for such a long time, holding on to it for as long as I did. It's like I'm extremely confident, perhaps overconfident, and I don't really worry about other women in the periphery. I care about myself and I care about the strength of the relationship that I build up with, in this case, my husband. I went into the dating world, I got exactly what I wanted, and I stepped out again. And I really didn't look back. That being said, I do have a very voracious sexual appetite, so the question then becomes, is it being driven by competition anxiety, or is it being driven by other things? I always looked at it and thought, like very, very early in the relationship, I looked at it and thought, okay, I want to continue having sex with him because I want him to always be sexually satisfied in a relationship with me. I don't want him to find himself unsatisfied in a relationship with me. He's agreed to give me monogamy. The least I can do is make sure that that monogamy is comfortable and satisfying to him. That was just how I looked at it. It's like, you're a man. Your sexual strategy is, or the best sexual strategy for you is going to be spreading your seed as far and wide as you can. You're foregoing that strategy to be with me. You're making a sacrifice. The least I can do is always provide you with, well, sex. And I've continued to do that, but that doesn't necessarily drive the voracious nature of it. What can I say? And I think that it is because, as Tomassi continues to elaborate throughout the book, I think of my husband as, he always puts it, he always puts emphasis on this, so the prize. And I do think of my husband that way. I think he is the prize that I wanted. I think he is, I honestly, having read the book as much as I have so far, I think he's one of these quote unquote natural alphas. I think that's just who he is. And it's mentioned in the book and it's been mentioned elsewhere. Finding a man who's going to like emanate that raw sexuality of the alpha male, while also being capable of being a good husband and a good provider and a good father, that's a very rare combination to find. I had to comb through approximately 2,500 men to meet one, but I did meet one. And once I met him, I married him, and I still perceive him as the prize. I don't think my continued sexual interest in him is necessarily driven so much by the fear that other women will come along and snatch him away from me as it is the fact that he is a desirable man, and you want to have sex with someone who's sexy. And honestly, sex is fun. And it serves a purpose. A lot of people, like when I was growing up, I met a lot of Christian, very fundamentalist people who were like, oh, sex is for procreative purposes only. And I always thought that was bullshit. Sex strengthens a relationship. It strengthens the bond between two partners. It brings them closer together. And so I would naturally want to be doing that as much as I can. So it's fun, it's comfortable, it feels good, and it also helps strengthen the relationship. I don't see any downside to it. And so that's probably what's driving my continual desire for my husband a little bit more than competition anxiety. Again, is it possible that competition anxiety is playing into my decision-making processes there? I mean, it's a very common thing. It's pretty much ubiquitous. It's very normal for women to have competition anxiety. It's more abnormal for a woman not to have competition anxiety. However, I don't see myself performing the behaviors that women typically perform when they have competition anxiety. I'm not trying to downplay the sexiness of other women. If a woman is sexy, she's sexy. That's just it. I'm not trying to distract men from other women so that I can garner their attention. If I'm on stage trying to do a performance, I want their attention so that I can take their money. I don't necessarily care about the attention itself. I do care about the money. I don't necessarily see the world the way women around me see it, and I don't interact with the world the way women around me interact with the world. Does that mean that competition anxiety isn't playing into my decisions? Well, the very fact that I looked at it and said, I want to always make sure that my husband is comfortable and satisfied sexually in our relationship. I mean, technically that's a form of competition anxiety. I mean, technically the idea is to keep him from developing a wandering eye. That's the idea of competition anxiety, but I never feel this anxiety that he describes where I think he might cheat on me if I don't constantly keep just reeling him back in. I want him to be happy because I love him. So it is competition anxiety. I'm sure it is to some extent. I just think it's something that falls on a spectrum, and some women have a lot more of it than I do. Most women, I think, have a lot more of it than I do. And I think I just have such a small degree of it that, I don't know. It just seems like I have a very, very small degree of this competition anxiety dimensions. I know I've talked about it a lot. It was just, that was my first big stumbling block in the book when I was reading it. To know. Oh my goodness. This is a good rule to know. I give up. Hold on. And now we come to the story of Cory Worthington. He was a teenager. His parents went out of town, so he decided to throw a party. And approximately 500 people showed up, and they trashed the neighborhood. And the police were called, and things were not good. This news anchor does an interview with him where she tries to get him to apologize for his irresponsible behavior, and he is just not backing down. It's a very funny interview to watch. This is the example that Tomassi brings forth as a good embodiment of alphaness. And Tomassi takes the time in this book to define alphaness and betaness. Not so much betaness, we kind of get that concept pretty quickly. for people who are reading. And the shorthand version of what alpha and beta are in the manosphere, not necessarily in like a biological textbook because that's kind of a different concept. So it's related, but it's not the same. Shorthand version, alpha is the man that women want to have the sex with. Beta is the man that women do not want to have the sex with. There's way more to it than that, but that's how I think a lot of men tend to characterize it, and they oversimplify it in those terms. Tomassi does take the time to kind of lay it out in broader term and talk about what it means to be alpha, which is important. A lot of men, especially in the pickup artist community, they have this tendency to latch onto a set of behaviors or strategies that will get them laid, where they emulate alphaness without ever having really incorporated it into their personality. And so they put on a show, and it's nice, and it might even draw feminine attention long enough to get laid, but it's not real. It's all smoke and mirrors. Until you figure out what makes an alpha and then become that, you don't really have a very solid grasp on what it is to be an alpha. And this is important. It's good. It's something you need to learn. I will say Cory Worthington was not the example I would have chosen. And I mean, one of the big ideas, and I don't think Tomassi is wrong with this, is that women will say they want one thing and actually want a different thing. And I think this is very true. Women say they want the man who brings them flowers and chocolates and watches the crummy romance movies with them, and talks about their feelings, and then they go run off with some guy who's, well, alpha, who's hot, who's exciting, who's maybe a little bit of a jerk. And guys don't understand this because they think that what women say is what they mean. And women don't necessarily know what they want. This is all good information to have, and I'm glad that Tomassi wrote his book so that men can understand this about women. That being said, Cory Worthington, still not the guy I would have chosen as the epitome of alphaness. I would have picked someone a little bit older, someone with experience to back up his confidence. A young man, he's being ballsy and he's being cavalier, but he doesn't necessarily have anything to back it up with. I remember men like that. I met young men like that frequently. I was never interested in them because they were stupid. It's like, yeah, you're all ballsy and you're all confident in yourself and you don't know jack shit. Why should I be interested in you? You don't know anything. And that was my impression of Cory Worthington. Do women have sex with guys like that? Yes, they do. All the time. Single mothers, who did you have sex with? Oh, a guy like that. It happens, but I always assumed, and this is one of the things that's been very interesting about the book, I'm not going to say Tomassi's wrong in his choice of Cory Worthington as this embodiment of alphaness, or as he calls him, the alpha Buddha, because he's so calm, probably because he's stoned out of his gourd. But I do believe that's why he was wearing the sunglasses. The dude was probably really stoned. But yeah, I always thought, and I always just assumed, that the reason guys like that get born and run around in the world is because they still get lucky. There are still women who are inexperienced and stupid enough to have sex with them, and those women sometimes are stupid enough to also get pregnant. And I mean, guys like Cory Worthington aren't responsible enough to say, hey, let me put on a condom. So these people continue being born, and occasionally being reckless and daring can really pay off. And so there is that alphaness to it. I just assumed that if a woman is actually looking for a mate, like a genuine, solid, attractive mate, she would choose someone who's reckless and daring, but actually knows what the fuck it is they're doing. So, someone a little more seasoned, someone a little bit older, someone who's got experience. You know what? I don't know. I mean, do women have sex with guys like Cory Worthington? Absolutely. Would I have a sex with a guy like that? No way in hell. Absolutely not. So that was a very brief reaction to the first section of Rollo Tomassi's book. There was so much more information in there than I had the time to cover. As it is, I had to make this video over the course of 2 days because I just didn't have enough time to talk about everything. And even then, there's tons of information in there that I never even begin to touch on. Next week, I'm going to be doing the next section. If anybody has any thoughts, ideas, suggestions, or just questions about the book, what they think about my reactions to the book, what their own reactions to the book were, I would love to hear from you guys, and I will talk to you later.